If you've ever been stumped on how to use vellum without it wrinkling, warping, or just disappearing into your card, this is the video for you. I'm diving into 13 different ways to add texture, color, and dimension using this beautiful translucent paper. We'll talk gluing tricks, layering hacks, and mix in everything from dye inks, oxide inks, and shimmery pastes. This is your ultimate vellum playbook, whether you're a beginner or a seasoned card maker looking for fresh inspiration. Ready to turn vellum into a showstopper? Let's get started. First things first, I'm going to talk about the different types of vellum I usually use. If you're already familiar with the different weights of vellum and their uses, please feel free to skip this part and move to the next segment where I show a few samples I created with paste and inks. But if you're new to vellum, let's go through a few basics. There are several types of paper vellum, but I usually work with two types, lightweight and heavyweight. The heavyweight one is also heat resistant. Now, the lightweight vellum I have is from Amazon. It's made in China and the packaging says that as well. The heavyweight vellum I use is from Salmon Says Stamp. I've tried a couple other brands, but this one and the one from Lawn Fawn are the best, and I always keep a pack handy. This heavyweight vellum is what I recommend for most of the hacks I'll be showing today. A couple of the techniques might work with lightweight vellum, but for the more advanced techniques, especially ones where vellum isn't just used as a diffusion panel, you'll want the better quality. Let me show you the difference between the two. You might not be able to tell easily on camera. This one here is the heavier vellum, and this is the lightweight one. Maybe you can tell that one is slightly more opaque, and it's always a good idea to use heavyweight vellum for anything other than general layering. All right, let me show you a few samples I created to demonstrate a few important points. I use this on two different panels, both on heavyweight vellum. I'll explain the differences in a bit. These two panels here were created using Altenew's Shimmer Relief Paste in rose gold. The other two were done using Astro Paste. Let's talk about paste in general. Pastes are thick and contain a lot of moisture, regardless of what kind of paste you're using. That's why I only worked with heavyweight vellum for this technique. I tape the vellum panel down before applying the paste through a stencil, because taping it down helps keep it flat and minimizes warping. I let these air dry for a bit, then used a heat tool briefly to reduce the drying time, but they were mostly air dried. On this one, I used the heat tool, and you can see what happened. The paste started to bubble up from too much heat. On the next attempt, I moved the heat tool faster across the surface, and that worked better. But the panel still buckled and warped quite a bit. It's really wavy and bumpy, as you can see, and it doesn't look good. Compare that to the Astro Paste panel. There was much less warping or buckling, and the result was significantly better. That could be because I applied a lighter coat of paste here. The shimmer paste, on the other hand, had to be applied with a heavier hand to avoid it looking unfinished or half-baked. What I've found is that whether you're using Altenew Shimmer Relief Paste or Astro Paste, the key is to use a minimal amount of paste and keep the stencil design small. This way, there's less paste on the vellum, which causes less warping or buckling. This panel, for example, turned out pretty good. I taped down one side and let it dry naturally for a few minutes. Astro Paste dries faster than the Shimmer Relief Paste anyway. I let it dry a bit before touching it again. You might notice small dents where the paste was applied. That's just the moisture reacting with the vellum. These were the samples I wanted to show you. Now, the other thing I wanted to try, because I've done a lot of ink blending before, was blending with a brayer and stenciling on vellum. I was just experimenting here, and the result was okay, but nothing to write home about, but definitely worth exploring. This panel here held up really well considering I heat set it. The secret is that I used heavyweight vellum. You can see I created a soft background using some stamped images. I used fairy dust embossing powder, which is basically a clear powder with a touch of glitter. Not sure if the glitter is visible on camera, but it adds a nice shimmer in person. Now, this panel was done using a DIY stencil that I made in one of my earlier videos. If you haven't seen my 13 more crafty hacks video, you definitely need to check it out. That's where I show you how I created the stencil. For the ink, I use Salmon Says Stamp dye ink on one panel and Distress Oxide ink on the other. You can really see the difference between the two. If you look closely, this one here with the dye ink has a very defined pattern. It looks crisp and intentional, almost like printed paper. Now compare that to this one done with Oxide ink. The actual pattern seems much more diffused, and the negative areas in the pattern look bolder. It's likely because oxide inks are more opaque, and on vellum, that makes the ink look denser. It kind of mutes the design instead of letting it shine through. I'm not an ink expert, but it seems that with the dye ink, you can see the full design as it was meant to be. But with the oxide ink, the pattern gets a bit lost. I feel like the negative space is more prominent than the actual stencil design. Let me show you the stencil I used. It's my DIY stencil, and yes, it's got dried paste and everything on it from earlier projects, but this is what I used for both panels. Same stencil, two very different outcomes just based on the ink type. In a lot of my earlier vellum videos where I've showed ink blending on vellum, many of you mentioned that your inks never seem to dry. I'm honestly puzzled by why that happens. I let both of these panels air dry, just left them out for a few minutes and they dried completely. If your vellum isn't drying, it could be something to do with the humidity or even the salinity in the air where you live. But here's a test. I'm rubbing the surface and there's no smudging, no ink transfer at all. I'll even drag the panel across a white sheet. You'll see nothing. It's totally dry. So if you're having that issue, maybe try letting it air dry a bit longer, or maybe experiment with your workspace conditions. I'll even do it again on camera and show you how it dries in just a few minutes. Keep watching because that's coming up next. I'm going to use a sticky mat from AliExpress. I've had it for ages, but you can find similar ones on Salmon Says Stamp, and I'll include a link on my blog. I use the sticky mat mostly for ink blending on vellum, and it helps to keep my panel from shifting. I prefer to then place my sticky mat on my magnetic mat, which helps me grip the stencil and keep everything aligned. Now I'm going to use my DIY stencil for this. I'll use washi tape to secure the stencil. Because I've lined my panel up against the grid line on the mat, aligning the stencil becomes really easy. For ink colors, I'm going with Pinkfresh Studios Cherry Blossom and Wisteria. I'll start with the Cherry Blossom. It's a very light pink, so I don't necessarily need to tap off any excess. Then I blend in the Wisteria, making sure there are no harsh lines. Since both shades are light, I'll keep layering the color until the edges are nicely blended. I'll also go back over with the pink to even it out. Before switching inks, I'll clean my stencil with a damp chamois, just a very light wipe to prevent any contamination when I use my blending tools over the stencil and then take it to my ink pad. I'll give this panel a few minutes to dry and I'll be right back. So it's been about 15 minutes and I'm back for the next step. I do see a bit of glitter from the DIY stencil, so I'll just brush that off. It's nice and dry, nothing rubbing off on my fingers either. Next, I'll reposition the stencil on the vellum panel and use some washi tape to hold the vellum and the stencil together. I'll use my die cutting machine now to emboss the vellum with the stencil so the stencil pattern can stand out with the embossed texture. Now here's a quick tip. I'll run a Swiffer over the rubber mat to make sure it's completely dust-free. Any speck of dust or glitter will get embossed into the vellum and ruin the project. Now I'll sandwich the panel with the stencil, rubber mat, adapter plate, and I'll add a paper shim since vellum is thin. And the best part is that I'm using a piece of cardstock that was slightly warped from a past experiment, and now it will get flattened out by the die cutting machine. Win-win, right? Now I'll run it all through the machine. The result is beautiful embossing. The texture is light but beautiful. Depending on your project, you can use either the embossed or the debossed side. I think I'll use the debossed side here. It's just so soft and elegant. I'm going to make a very simple and elegant card with this. Keep watching to see the final result. For this next card, I'm going to create a shadow image using vellum, and I'll be making a 5x7 card. You may have seen me making something similar in my 5 vellum card techniques video, but I'll be doing this a little bit differently. I used alcohol markers in the previous video, but I'll use my Caron watercolor markers for this one. The vellum sheet I'm using is 8.5 by 11 inches, so I'll take 1 inch off the 11-inch side to bring it to 10 inches to give me the 5-inch side of the card when I fold it in half. I'm going to score it, but I need to be very gentle when scoring vellum. If I press too hard, it might tear. Even with heavyweight vellum, it can crack a little, so I'll take extra care when scoring. I need the other side to be 7 inches, and since the sheet is 8.5 inches wide, I'll trim off 1.5 inches. The vellum base is ready. Now I need a note card for the inside, so I'll make a 4x6 note card. I'll trim one side to 6 inches. Next, I'll trim off half an inch from the 8.5-inch side to make it 8 inches and then fold it in half. That'll give me a 4x6. Now we have our folded note card and the vellum card. The plan is to tuck the note card inside the vellum base to create that layered shadow effect. For the focal point, I'm using a floral stamp set. This is the Japanese anemone from Altenew. I'll add a link to it in my blog post if it's still available. It's such a beautiful set, and it's actually a part of the Build a Garden series and comes with coordinating dies and stencils, which I won't be using today since I'll be using the Karen markers to color the flowers. By the way, my blog post is linked in the description below and you'll find all the supplies listed there. I'll first stamp my note card. For that, I'll find the center of where the 5x7 card will be and then press it down on the Misty sticky mat. The grid makes it easy for me to find the center of both the vellum card and the 4x6 note card that goes inside. If you don't have a sticky grid mat, center the note card over the vellum card. Position the stamp and stamp the note card first. Remove it and then stamp the vellum. It really doesn't matter how you do it as long as the image is centered on each card because they'll need to align in the end. To keep the vellum shut while stamping, I'll create a small roll of washi tape and place it inside the fold. That is going to hold everything together. I'm going to heat emboss with Ranger Ultrafine Gold Embossing Powder, and before I ink up the stamp, I want to make sure it's clean and positioned properly. I'm one of those people who uses the Misty the wrong way, but this time I'm using it in the correct orientation so the grid lines face the right way, making it much easier to measure and align the stamp. I'm using clear embossing ink and pressing down using my pressure tool to get a clean impression. I'll remove the note card from the Misty and apply the gold embossing powder and set it aside to do the exact same thing with the vellum. Now I'll gently remove the vellum panel and add embossing powder to it. Unfortunately, I forgot to use anti-static powder on the vellum, so I'll have to painstakingly brush off most of the excess powder. So let me take care of that and I'll be right back. With both the vellum and the note card ready, I'll start heat embossing. I'll begin with the note card so the heat tool gets nice and hot before taking it to the vellum. To avoid warping, I keep the vellum from both sides, and since the image is quite large, you will see a tiny bit of warping, but it's not too bad. Especially because I preheated the tool when I heat embossed the note card first. Now for the fun part, coloring. I'll color the stamped image on the note card using my Karen markers, and since they're watercolor based, they won't tarnish the gold embossing, unlike alcohol markers. That's a big bonus. Since it's a large image, it's going to take me a few minutes to complete this step, so I'll play some music and speed you through this. You're welcome to skip ahead to the next step. I like to add a few flicks for the veins of the petals and the leaves. Now I'll add a 4x6 panel inside the note card to hide the light bleeding of the watercolor markers. I'll glue the note card inside the vellum base, making sure the two stamped images align perfectly. Here's a great hack for gluing vellum to cardstock without the glue showing. I'll take tiny bits of glue on a strip of cardstock and apply it lightly to the card base instead of to the vellum. Now, if you look at the vellum, you don't see any visible signs of gluing, right? I felt the front would become too heavy, so I'll add another 4x6 panel behind the vellum for stability. That also helps the card stand up better. When you open it, you see the pretty note card with the colored image, and there's still space inside to write your message. I'll add a sentiment later, so stay tuned to see how I finish this card. Let's move on to the next one that adds a really elegant touch to your card fronts without needing too much effort. So for this next card, I'm going to use a lacy vellum border for a touch of elegance. You can see here that the border is really dainty and pretty. To build this card, I used matting dies from Spellbinders to cut two layers, one in cream cardstock and one in navy. I also cut out the center of the cream panel. No one's going to see that part, so it's a great way to conserve supplies. I layered the cream and navy pieces, then placed the vellum border to create a beautiful lace effect. First, I add the cream layer to the card base and place an acrylic block on top to hold it down while it dries. While that's drying, I'll cut a thin strip of the cream cardstock about 1/2 inch wide because I want to add it behind the vellum lace to give it the appearance of ribbon while also creating a grounding element for it. Here's another gluing hack. I'll squeeze out some glue onto a non-stick surface, which in this case is a piece of backing paper from my Altenew double-sided adhesive. Then I'll use a makeup sponge to pick up the glue and dab it on the strip of cardstock. Once I apply the vellum lace, the glue will hold it in place, and then I can use the paper strip trick again to apply a little more glue where it's needed. Next, I'll trim the strip to the right size and attach it to the navy layer. Once I trim the vellum border, it looks like a lovely ribbon tucked behind the lace. So elegant. While that dries, I'll grab a sentiment I had prepped earlier. I'd originally used it on another card I didn't much care for and saved the die cut from it. I'll just apply some liquid glue on the foam tape when it's time to stick it down. I'll place the sentiment slightly off to the side and add some florals to the left. It's time to finish adhering the panels. You can see the vellum is nicely glued down and there's no visible glue at all. I've cut out a bunch of these tiny flowers and I'll go ahead and plan how to arrange them. This is another place where the press and seal hack comes in handy. I'll arrange everything on the card first, then press a piece of press and seal over the top, which will allow me to lift the entire arrangement off the card base, apply glue, and place it back down exactly as I had it. I'll complete the card and show it to you in just a bit. It's time to show you another technique that can take your cards to the next level, and it's by adding vellum florals and foliage. For this card, I've cut out a few vellum flowers and leaves, but I'll only use these sprigs, and that too, I'll snip off the leaves and flower buds and use them separately. Don't be afraid to use them in a different way. Adding a few vellum elements to your floral arrangements transforms the card design completely. Let's continue with the next technique. I already have a piece of vellum cut and stuck to my mat. I'm not using a MISTI for this one. I'm going with a tiny floral stamp from the Salmon Says Stamp Beautiful Blooms set. It's perfect for creating a patterned vellum overlay. This panel will become a vellum card cover. The size of this panel is 4¾ inches by 5½ inches. The reason I made it 4¾ inches instead of 4¼ is so I can fold that extra ½ inch behind the card panel later. This way I can attach the vellum cleanly without visible adhesive. Now I'm going to heat emboss this. To create the pattern, I'll stamp the tiny image repeatedly across the vellum. Each time I stamp, I'll rotate the stamp slightly to keep the pattern from looking too uniform. I'll also stamp off the edges so it appears more natural, like a continuous background. It's looking pretty good to me. Next, I'll gently lift the vellum off the mat, and instead of yanking it up, I curl the mat slightly so the vellum peels off cleanly. This helps prevent curling. Now I'm sprinkling on Ranger Ultrafine Gold Embossing Powder. I did notice I accidentally touched the stamp in a few places, so there's a bit of extra embossing ink where it shouldn't be, but I'll clean it up before heat setting. I'm back after cleaning off the stray powder using a small brush, and I've secured the vellum flat with magnets. I did notice that one stamp might have shifted while I was stamping it, and there's a bit of ghosting, but no worries, it's a handmade card after all. I'll preheat my heat tool thoroughly, then emboss the panel. Since the magnets are holding it down and I'm using heavyweight vellum, it'll hold up beautifully under the heat. I love watching the powder melt into this lovely gold shimmer. There are a few tiny specks of stray embossing powder here and there, but I'll use my mono eraser to remove them once the vellum cools down. Honestly, the little bits just add texture. It's not a big deal, but the result is gorgeous. Now for the card assembly. I trimmed the navy base to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, a standard A2 size, and I kept the left edge of the vellum panel free from stamping so I could score and fold it behind the panel. I'll score gently along the ½ inch line. I'm being careful here, but I do hear a little cracking, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed it'll be okay. Next, I fold the edge back and glue it to the back of the navy panel. I like using pre-made card bases, so this entire arrangement will go directly onto one of those. Now I'll trim a little off of each side of the panel so there's a nice even white border all around. Once it's done, I'll line it up and glue it down. The nice thing about liquid glue is that you can adjust it slightly before it sets. Next, I'll adhere the sentiment inside the card instead of on the outside. I think it adds a fun little surprise when the card is opened. A few jewels for embellishment, and there you go. Another beautiful way to use vellum. Heat emboss it, wrap it around your card front, and tuck a sentiment inside for a little surprise. So for the next one, I'm going to use the same stencil and astro paste I used for my sample panels. This astro paste is Clear Skies, and the stencil is Spellbinder Stencil of the Month, March 2025. I love this set of stencils. I've brought in my craft mat for this part because I'm going to tape the vellum panel down and let it air dry in that taped position. Taping it down helps keep the panel flat and the mat protects my surface. I'll center the stencil over the panel. I want the pattern to be symmetrical, so I'll keep the left and right borders even, knowing I may trim the edges later, but it depends. Then I'll tape down the panel and stencil. I'll scoop out some of the astro paste onto the stencil. I'll spread the paste evenly using my Simon Hurley scraper tool and fill in all the gaps in the stencil. Another benefit of adding the tape is that it keeps the paste from spilling onto my mat. Here's a tip. Keep a baby wipe nearby to clean your tools as you go. I also like to scrape off the excess paste if it doesn't get mixed with other colors and put it right back in the jar so nothing goes to waste. Now I'll quickly go wash the stencil off while I allow the paste to dry completely before removing the tape. It's been about 15 minutes and the paste is nice and dry. And let's peel to reveal, shall we? Look at how flat this panel is. No heat tool needed, just air drying while taped down. That's the key. It's as if there was no paste on it at all, just a flat piece of vellum. Also, I didn't apply a whole lot of paste to the vellum, so that's another consideration. Let's move on to using the panel on a card. I'm going to use this panel as a top layer over a piece of alcohol ink pattern paper. I'll test a few different prints to find the best one and pick a vibrant part to go behind the vellum. I also have a die cut sentiment for this card. Initially, I planned to use a vellum shadow behind the die cut, but the surface already has so much texture that the vellum didn't do much. Even with a shadow layer, the die cut wasn't popping out enough. So I scrapped that idea and decided to go with a white cardstock shadow behind the die cut. If you're using heavily patterned paper and want to soften the look, vellum is great for diffusing busy backgrounds. Because the die cut is intricate, I use the makeup sponge again to dab glue onto the back where needed. I trimmed the pattern paper to A2 size, which is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and applied foam tape behind it to add some dimension, and then adhered it to the card base. This whole card came together so quickly. Just a bit of paste, a background layer, and a dimensional sentiment. The vellum adds elegance without overpowering the design. Here's the next gluing hack and diffusion hack in one. The more gap you add between the vellum and the background, especially if it's a busy one, the more diffusion you'll get. Even though this pattern paper isn't that busy and overpowering, I still want to add a little gap between the background and the vellum to have the focus mainly on the textured vellum. So I've cut out a second shadow using thick cardstock, and once I've adhered the sentiment to the front of the vellum panel, I'll add the second shadow right behind it to lift the vellum off the background. I added small drops of glue behind the elements on the vellum panel, like the little flower petals here, so nothing would be visible while nothing would lift. I'd be remiss if I didn't spend a few minutes showing you how I do ink blending with Oxides, because it's one of my favorite techniques for creating elegant and soft cards. I mostly use dye or oxide inks for blending depending on the look I'm going for. Dye inks retain the translucence of the vellum, while oxide inks create a bolder and more opaque look. And it's also worth noting that ink blending facilitates faster drying, since the ink is spread around and not concentrated on specific areas. I've never tried stamping with pigment inks on vellum unless I'm heat embossing after. Here you see me blending with 3 oxide inks. One hack I'll mention here is the post-it hack I picked up from Gina K of Gina K Designs. If you stick your finger on the adhesive strip, it acts like a tiny bodyguard, protecting the ink from smudging and keeping your fingerprints off the vellum. It's the perfect trick for staying smudge-free and avoiding a surprise cameo in any forensic investigations. Believe me, those fingerprints show up with immense clarity. I usually allow the vellum to air dry, but today I'll use the heat tool from a distance to speed the drying process while avoiding too much heat on it. As you can see, the vellum has dried, but I see some white spots where the ink didn't blend quite well, so I'll add a little more of the Stormy Sky ink. I love this combo. I find it sweet and delicate. All right, that's done, and now I'll dry emboss the vellum with a Salmon Says Stamp embossing folder. The best practice for dry embossing with vellum is to use a piece of cardstock behind the vellum panel. That prevents the vellum from cracking, and also you get a 2-for-1. You can use the embossed cardstock panel on another project. The sandwich I find most useful for my Spellbinders Platinum 6 is using platform A, platform B, then the embossing folder with the vellum and cardstock inside, then the F shim and an additional piece of cardstock to add bulk since the vellum is really thin. Unlike when I'm embossing with cardstock alone, I don't mix the cardstock with water because the moisture will transform to the vellum, which will then end up curling. This is where I get a huge shock. While rushing to keep this video from getting too long, I didn't pay attention to the orientation of the embossing folder, and I ended up with a debossed design. The design is directional, so unfortunately I can't really flip this over and use the reverse side. But I think you get the idea of ink blending and then dry embossing a vellum panel to turn it into a card. I'm sharing a couple of photos of another card I'd made not so long ago using the exact same technique. Add a note card inside, a sentiment on top, and maybe some embellishments, and you're done. For this card, I lost the entire footage because we had a massive thunderstorm and a major power outage that lasted hours. However, this is a very simple card and I'll explain what I did. I created an A2 card with that apple green cardstock, and then I scored the front panel at 2 1/8 inches and I folded it over so that it creates a Z-fold card. Next, I took this die and cut out that pink cotton candy cardstock, and then I adhered a piece of heavyweight vellum behind the die cut panel because I backed it up with this bold print right behind the vellum. I wanted to make sure the sentiment die cut shows up, but it wouldn't if the pattern paper were too bold. It would be really cluttered. So vellum is a fantastic way to diffuse any bold designs, and adding the vellum behind the die cut and then adding the pattern paper behind the vellum created a diffusion panel, and this looks so much more delicate and beautiful. I also added a strip of vellum to the front panel that I used with the same pattern paper, and I added some washi tape, leaves and butterflies from Pinkfresh Studios' Fluttering Butterflies collection. To adhere the vellum, I simply adhered the leaves first and then the butterfly to hide where the leaves were joined, and then I added glue behind the leafy elements. Then I adhered on the pattern paper panel so the glue doesn't show, and I just zhuzhed up the butterfly wings a little bit with some foam tape underneath the wings, and that gives it some dimension, and added a few gold pearls, and that was the card. I think it turned out really pretty. The only regret I have is of adding those 3 butterflies inside. I think I should have left the card panel blank and it would have been much better. I'm finding those butterflies a little bit immature and I have no idea what drove me to add them. It's just that it's my fondness for butterflies, and whenever I get a chance to add butterflies anywhere, I'll just stick them down. So there's that little panel where you can write. I can also add another white panel behind the card to allow more space for writing a message, and those strips that I've saved will be used for decorating the envelope. If you like learning about crafty hacks that will make your card making way more efficient and more fun, you need to check out this video here.